Bienvenue à ce webinaire sur
Hello and welcome to our webinar.
sur les pays à faible revenu et sur
We
l'Afrique.
are going to be talking about low-income countries in Africa, geopolitics, and interactions between those concepts. Now, I think many of you understand the current geopolitical climate is one that a number of analysts describe as being one of multiple crises. With COVID-19, we also have value chains being fragilized, war in Ukraine, invasion from Russia. We also have tension in the Middle East. We have witnessed the rise of tariffs as a lever by the Trump administration. And this has led, generally speaking, to geo-economic tension in not so much geopolitical, but geo-economic tension. At the same time, there is a questioning of the US hegemony coming from China, but this is also coming from a number of other nations, emerging nations. A number of analysts have said that this general backdrop has created a breaking point in the global economic order. Ever since the end of the Cold War through to today, through globalization, through economic interdependency, this has given way to market practices. Well, the understanding was that it was meant to ease geopolitical tension. It was meant to be a driver for some countries, at least, for peace. Whereas today, what we are seeing is that this interdependency is seen more as a threat that is leading to fragmentation or even militarization. And this is what we are seeing with a number of major countries. Certain countries are trying to leverage that interdependency to take control of some of those key interdependency networks. This can be analyzed either from major global powers, United States, Europe, China, looking at global geopolitics. And that's what we have seen most analysis looking at. But generally speaking, it hasn't really looked at the low-income nations, the more vulnerable nations, especially in the African continent. These This is why we wanted to bring a number of people together today. We have Amadou, who is for the IMF. We also have Panellists, who should join us a little later, who is General Director for South-Strategic Investments, highly active in Africa. We also have Lucie, who is Vice President for Senior Sovereign Risk Group at Moody's. She is particularly in charge of Africa. And then we have Jaime Melo, who is a researcher at FERDI, but also a keen specialist of international relations and predominantly in terms of economic development in Africa. Today, we want to look at the fallout that this is having on low-income nations, the fragmentation, the militarization of interdependency. How is that impacting these nations? Is it actually slowing down global economic growth? And with that slowdown, this is going to have an impact on low-income nations. The second point that we wanted to talk about in terms of African low revenue or low-income nations is that this backdrop, this general context, is giving rise to a strategy for African and low-income nations, where there is to be an alignment or an entry into competition for certain blocks of countries. because this is a way of tackling the
fragmentation.
secondary
Et puis,
fallout
on peut aussi
that comes from this fragmentation.
imaginer les moyens que auraient les pays africains et les pays les plus
And the other
pauvres
question we can talk about is what sort of
vulnérables
resources and
pour
means
être
do African nations
plus
and
résilients
low-income nations
par rapport à cette
to become more
montée ou
resilient,
cette
to be able
tendance
to
de
stave off the
d'augmentation des
effects
tensions
of the
géoéconomiques
rising
et puis
geo-economic tension?
de renforcement
What can they do to
de la
to
fragmentation.
bolster
Voilà,
their own
visiblement,
defenses
je passe la
against
parole
fragmentation?
d'abord
So that's it
à
for me
Amadou
for the
Si.
introduction. I would now like to quickly hand over to Amadou Si.
Amadou, la parole est à toi.
The floor is
Oui,
yours.
merci Bruno et encore merci à tout le monde pour cette invitation. Donc je vais essayer de
Bruno, thank you very
partager.
much, and thank
Je sais
you
pas
for the
si
invitation. Now, I'm
vous
trying
pouvez
to share my
voir.
screen here. Hopefully, you can see it all.
Donc enfin très rapidement, je vais essayer un peu de brosser un petit aperçu de
I would like to give you
nous
a very
faisons
quick
ici au
overview
niveau
on what we
de
do at
l'équipe
the
qui
IMF
s'occupe
within our
du
team.
rapport sur les perspectives
Our
économiques
team, which is in
régionales
charge
sur
of
l'Afrique
regional
subsaharienne.
economic politics
Alors,
in sub-Saharan
peut-être
Africa.
pour commencer, quelques définitions.
Let's
Parce
start out
que,
with a few basic
euh,
definitions.
voilà, donc il y a sûrement plusieurs définitions, mais pour le moment,
I mean,
donc,
there are many definitions that we could have, but
nous regardons ça sous l'angle
for the
d'un
time being,
renversement de
we
l'intégration
want to look at this from the point of view of
motivé par des politiques souvent
changing
guidées par des considérations
integration
stratégiques. Donc,
as driven by
nous
strategic
avons commencé
economic
à
policy.
travailler surtout dessus après l'invasion
This is
de
something that we have
l'Ukraine
been
par la
working
Russie
on predominantly
en
since Russia
2022.
invaded Ukraine
Donc,
in 2022.
c'était un choc quand même global, mais
It
qui a eu des
had global
effets assez
repercussions,
importants sur l'Afrique subsaharienne,
considerable
et j'y
repercussions in
reviendrai.
sub-Saharan
Et
Africa, and I will
de
talk about this a little
2023,
later. In
on a essayé de regarder
2023,
un peu plus dans les détails
we
avec une
looked
note d'analyse
closer at
pour voir un
detail at a
peu
number of analytical
quel serait
reports.
l'impact
In our
économique
analytical
de la
memo,
fragmentation
what will
géoéconomique
geo-economic fragmentation have
adressée
in terms
vers
of
l'équipe
economic
générale et tout.
impact in
Et
the sub-Saharan
finalement,
region?
cette année, en octobre,
And then this
on a
year,
eu
in
encore, on
October,
peut dire, trois nouveaux choc, celui de
there were
l'augmentation des droits de
a,
douane sur les
a
exportations
number
vers les
of
États-Unis, avec en
major events that we
corollaire
saw, the rise of
l'expiration de
trade tariffs
préférentielle au
with an
titre
impact on
de
US
l'AGOA,
trade.
la loi sur la
Then we
croissance et
also had
l'exportation en
AGOA,
Afrique, et également ces annonces de plusieurs pays
and while
riches
there
concernant
have
une
been
forte
statements made
presse
about
d'aide
certain
étrangère
high-income
à
nations
destination des pays de la région. Et
and funding going
finalement,
from
tout
those nations
ça
to regional countries,
avec une incertitude élevée
this
et
has
des
created
tensions
a level of
géopolitiques.
uncertainty. So
Donc,
foreign aid has dropped and
les
uncertainty
canaux de
has risen.
transmission, bon, on continue à
When we look
travailler
at
dessus, mais
channels of
alors
transmission
c'est
or channels of
surtout,
transfer,
peut-être, je peux parler de cinq canaux, hein.
I
Premier, c'est,
feel that there are
comme
five
je
key
l'ai
channels.
dit, les perturbations sur le commerce international. On a vu
We have seen
la hausse des tarifs
a
douaniers,
major impact on
le
international trade with the
protectionnisme
rise of
accru
trade
et qui
tariffs.
perturbe les chaînes d'approvisionnement mondiales
This has had an
et les
impact
chaînes de
on
main-d'œuvre.
global supply
On a aussi
chains.
une reconfiguration
We've
des flux
also
financiers
seen a
avec
reshuffling of
l'utilisation des
financial flows
investissements indirects
with
étrangers,
FDI, so
l'aide
foreign direct
internationale, et
investment,
j'en ai
becoming
parlé
more
tout de suite, et les
political,
sanctions.
international aid as well,
Et on a aussi eu
sanctions.
un impact de l'incertitude politique
We've also
on
witnessed the
utilise des
impact of
mesures
political uncertainty.
d'indices d'incertitude
So we look
politique
at political uncertainty indexes in this analysis.
pour voir un peu comment cette hausse des
We
incertitudes
use
a un
that
impact à
analysis
court
to
terme,
try
moyen
and see
terme et
what
même à long terme.
short, mid,
C'est
and
un
long-term
peu
impact
comme ce qui avait été fait
it
lorsque
is
les
having.
chercheurs
This
regardaient
is
un
similar to
peu
what
l'impact
analysts used to do
du
when looking
Brexit, hein, sur
at the
l'économie
impact of
britannique, par
Brexit
exemple.
on the
Et
UK
finalement,
economy.
pour la région, très important, le choc
Another
sur les
important
prix
factor
des
for the
matières
region
premières.
is the
On a
impact
vu
that this
ça
has
avec
had on
l'Ukraine,
commodity prices.
l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie. On a vu cette
So
hausse
following
des
the
prix alimentaires, des prix
invasion
des engrais
in
aussi,
Ukraine, we
des
have seen
prix
an increase in prices of fertilizer,
des produits énergétiques et une
energy,
inflation
huge
dans la
inflation
région.
throughout the
Et
region.
finalement, si on recule un peu, on peut voir aussi
If we then take a step
l'impact
back,
sur l'évolution
we
du
can also
système
see that this has had
monétaire
an
international
impact
avec
on
cette
international
domination du
monetary
dollar
systems,
qui commence à être, du dollar
with the
américain qui
US
commence
dollar, the
à être
American dollar,
remise en cause
which
avec
is
des nouveaux systèmes de
no longer
paiement,
really being seen
notamment
as
avec, pour les paiements en yuan avec
the go-to
le
currency,
commerce avec la
with
Chine,
payment
l'évolution des
defaults,
réserves des devises
China, the
réserves
yuan,
aussi.
certain
Donc,
countries changing their reserves.
pourquoi l'Afrique est-elle particulièrement affectée?
So why is Africa in
Bon,
particular
alors
hard
l'Afrique est
hit?
très vulnérable, hein. On a
Africa is quite
cette
vulnerable.
vulnérabilité
This
structurelle.
is due to structural vulnerabilities that we have throughout
Une
the
forte
continent.
dépendance aux matières
We are
premières,
highly dependent
donc,
on
qui expose bien
primary
sûr
resources.
les pays de la région. Bon, ben, on a des pays exportateurs, des pays importateurs, par
There
contre, ce sont les
are
règles
countries
sont
throughout
de
the
l'or
region
qui vont
that
fortement
have
augmenter.
trade
C'est un
imbalance,
bénéfice.
either
Mais en tout cas, on
exporters
est exposé
or
aux
net
fluctuations des
importers.
prix des matières premières. Une
But this
faible
is
intégration
predominantly
commerciale,
driven
hein,
by a
c'est une faible
dependency on
intégration dans les
primary
chaînes de
resources.
valeur
On top of
mondiale
that,
et aussi peu de
there is
valeur
poor
ajoutée.
integration,
Tout
trade
ceci limite
integration
la
for international
diversification
value chains,
commerciale des pays africains. On a la réduction de l'aide publique
and
au
very
développement
little
qui pourrait
added
être une source
value
pour
through trade
renforcer la
diversification in
résilience en
African
crise,
countries. On top
surtout
of that,
quand
there has been a
on
drop
a
in
peu de
public
coussins de
aid,
sécurité au niveau du budget et
and
finalement
this has
qui font
created
l'espace
budgetary and debt
d'hypercrédibilité et la dette
vulnerabilities.
élevée. Peut-être
So
moins la dette
high debt.
moins un
Well,
problème
actually,
de
it's
dette
not
élevée,
that
plutôt un problème de coût
debt is rising. It's
du
more that the
service de la dette
cost
qui est très
of
très
servicing
élevé.
that debt, which is very high.
Donc, effet direct de la fragmentation géopolitique, peut-être je me répète un peu, mais bon, j'essaie de
Some of this
soutenir
is going to be going back over things that I've
les
just said, but it's
suggestions
important to
que vous
really
avez
make sure
données.
that
Mais donc, pour les
we
effets directs, on peut voir
have a proper understanding of the
déjà,
situation.
on a
So
vu, par
direct
exemple, si
effects.
quand on a regardé l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la
So as I
Russie,
said, invasion of Ukraine by
l'augmentation des
Russia.
droits de
This
douane,
we've
l'aide
also had other
étrangère et
direct
l'incertitude. On
effects,
peut,
including
on
increased
peut quand
trade
même
tariffs
mettre
on
quelques
exports to the
chiffres,
United
hein,
States.
avec,
To give you a few
on peut voir un
figures,
peu ce qui s'est passé au niveau des indicateurs économiques,
we
hein. Bon.
can see it all
Bon,
across
maintenant, il faut
key economic
relativiser
indicators.
parce que,
But
bon,
all of this needs to be
l'Afrique
taken
subsaharienne,
with a grain of salt
ces
because
régions ne sont
sub-Saharan
pas un
Africa
pays.
is
Mais par
just a
exemple,
region, it's not an
pour
individual
ce qui
country.
concerne l'augmentation des
And
droits de
when
douane,
looking at the increase in trade
vu le
tariffs,
faible niveau d'échange entre l'Afrique
given the low
subsaharienne
level of
et les
trade
États-Unis,
between the United States and sub-Saharan
on voit que
Africa,
ça touche surtout
we
quelques
feel
pays
that
comme
this
les
isn't a regional
Lesotho, par
issue,
exemple,
it's
les
more
exportations de
country by
textiles
country
vers
issue.
les
Lesotho,
États-Unis.
with its textile industry,
Lesotho représente 10% du PIB.
10% of GDP.
Madagascar aussi se trouve dans une
Madagascar
situation analogue.
as
Donc, c'est
well,
vraiment certains
similar
pays
situation. It's really just a
ministres de
few
la droite
countries
qui sont beaucoup plus
who have benefited from
vulnérables à cette
AGOA over
hausse
the
des
past few
droits de
years, who
douane.
have been most vulnerable
Maintenant, pour
given
l'aide
the rising
étrangère,
trade tariffs.
on a déjà vu qu'il y avait une tendance à la baisse, hein,
In
de l'aide
terms
étrangère.
of
Et bien sûr, tous les pays ne bénéficient pas
FDI, we
de
have
la
seen a
même
slow drop.
manière.
Now, while not all countries
En
benefit
gros,
to the
c'est
same extent, we're
1,5%
talking roughly
du
about
total des revenus
1.5% of
de la
all
région, les aides
income in the
bilatérales.
region
Les chiffres changent
coming
tout le
from
temps, mais
bilateral aid. Now, the figures, they do change
on avait anticipé une baisse de
constantly,
16 à
but we
28% en
expect
2025.
a 16 to
Et il est très
28% drop throughout
vraisemblable que ces réductions se
2025.
poursuivent au cours des années suivantes.
And
Et
this
bien
is a
sûr,
drop that is
comme
going
pour
to continue
l'aide,
in
ça va
coming
toucher
years.
surtout les pays fragiles,
This is
la
really
République
going to
centrafricaine,
impact the
le
Central African
Soudan du
Republic,
Sud, le
South
Niger,
Sudan,
où certaines réductions
Niger,
pourraient dépasser plus de
low-income
10%
nations.
des recettes publiques.
These
On
are
a
nations
essayé de faire
where
aussi un modèle
FDI makes up a
d'équilibre
large
général,
portion
mais c'était
of all
après, en
national income.
2023. Donc,
Now,
mais,
what about
donc,
economic forecast for
ce
the
modèle,
region in April
enfin, les
2023? This
prémices,
is
c'était
our
qu'au cours
snapshot.
des 20 dernières années, quand même,
Generally speaking, over the
l'Afrique
past 20 years,
subsaharienne a
sub-Saharan Africa
bénéficié de
had benefited from economic integration at a global scale with trade alliances with new economic partners. Traditionally speaking, it was European Union and the United States, but we saw China and other emerging nations arising as new trade partners. This was highly beneficial for the region over the past few decades. But with geo-economic fragmentation, this does raise a number of concerns for negative fallout. Because of that, sub-Saharan Africa is likely to be the most penalized region in a fragmented world. This is a scenario where we have two major blocks. So we've got emerging nations in China on one side and the EU and USA on the other side, and a huge division being drawn between these two sides, where countries are forced to choose between one side or the other. Some expect that this sort of fragmentation will lead to a 4% drop in GDP in sub-Saharan Africa. So what can we do to boost resilience? There is a lot of talk about regional integration with the AFCFTA. So how can we ramp up regional integration? There is all sorts of recommendations, policies, trade policy. But what can we actually do? The other main issue is diversification. So how can Africa incorporate in its value chains such notions? In terms of financial flows, we can see that there is a bit of movement out there. We've got Exim Bank, Standard Bank, South African banks that are now integrated in the CIPS, the CIPS. This is an interbank system for money transfers that enabled transfers between the region and China in yuan. And this is because there's a general desire to lower the cost of financial transactions. Mobile money is really moving ahead at great pace. And it's not just in East Africa, in Kenya, but also in all other zones in the region where you can actually transfer money between countries using the various money systems, mobile money systems that are being put in place. And when we look at stable coins, more and more people are using them, and we're keeping a close eye on that.
When it comes to domestic resources and markets, there's a greater focus on domestic markets. Countries finance, governments are financed at more than 50% by domestic markets. I think I will stop there. The region is very vulnerable. It's not only due to geopolitical fragmentation, it's also due to economic shocks. But the goal is to strengthen the region with good macroeconomic policies, with good, proper security councils, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I will stop sharing my slides. Thank you. Thank you so much, Amadou. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Lucie Villa. to know how credit rating agencies take into account such geopolitical risks. And in this new context, it is clear that figures shared by Amadou and IMF show a clear fragmentation with significant consequences on GDP. And many African countries are more vulnerable to shocks than other countries. I guess this also has an impact on credit rating.
Merci beaucoup et bonjour à tous.
You have the floor.
Merci pour l'invitation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to take the floor today. And indeed, I represent the Moody's group here today. It is one of the world's major credit rating agencies. We always focus on credit rating. What's credit rating? It's assessing whether a country will be able to make payments or whether there will be default. So we are calculating estimations, we're projecting data. So we usually make predictions by 3 or 5 years. In our approach, we have a very precise calculations in terms of probabilities. We take into account a wide array of factors to make such credit ratings. One of the key factors we take into account focuses on risks, political risk, which is an internal risk, and we also focus on geopolitical risks, which happens at an international scale. When describing risks, we try to be as clear as possible about which risk is more prevalent, and we estimate scenarios. We share common work methods with the IMF, with scenarios. We work on a central scenario and less central scenarios, which helps us build bridges with credit rating. We take into account the ability of states to finance their debt, and what's specific to governments when it comes to credit rating is that governments have debts, so they need to be able to serve their debt and finance it. So I just wanted to give you some definitions to make sure that we level the playing field in terms of understanding. So we work on scenarios, we analyze scenarios, and we try to identify how geopolitical risks are tied to other risks. For instance, governments not being able to face difficult situations in the case of a crisis. What I wanted to say is that as we focus on Africa, we realize that geopolitical and political risks show clear results. I like to say that we are transparent. We identify which countries are more at risk than others. We give grades all across the world. And actually, credit rating in Africa is not that different to credit rating in Europe or Asia. The worst grade is Ukraine in Europe and on On average, we reach a credit rating of BA. So Africa's case is not really that different, but there's a correlation of risks. The thing is, these are border markets, relatively not developed economies that are reliant on external funds for imports, for support. For instance, governments receiving support from the IMF or from the World Bank. And that's something we take into account in the balance of payments because it's an incoming flux of money. And we focus on the correlation of risks. And as soon as there is an area of weakness, there's a quicker effect in Africa than in other regions. And that's because these are border economies, as I was saying. And to be fully transparent, it's also due to governance and support at a supranational level, because such countries need a supranational support. They receive the help of a program of the IMF, of the World Bank. They receive bilateral help, whether developed economies like the United States or France, among others, or China, which is a major contributor, at least for concessional financing. And this type of support depends on the alignment we were mentioning earlier in the webinar. It depends whether the country is politically aligned, aligned with norms. These are norms that Bretton Woods authorities want to see and identify to be able to provide help. Transparency, respecting human rights and freedoms. That is a set of economic and social values that are recognized by authorities, and they are considered positive. So there will be international support. But as soon as there's a lack of alignment, the international community will give less support. And unfortunately, that's when political and geopolitical risks increase and governments face complex situations. And there is a shining example of that, unfortunately, Ethiopia, with tensions that are hard to tackle for local authorities, regardless of diplomatic considerations. When one thinks of a government that has to deal with conflicts in different regions, losing support, international support, at that precise moment is going to have a direct impact, and it's going to worsen the country's situation. So we have to anticipate that in terms of credit rating, and the international community has to anticipate that kind of situation as well, to be able to provide some support while respecting the sovereignty of countries. Then countries can say whether they think this will be sustainable regarding debt or not. And that is part of our job, and that is the challenge. We cannot merely wait for situations to unfold. Our role is to change our estimations, to flag risks, ideally 1 year before situations unfold. Our rating has worth if and only if we are able to calculate it in advance. That's the last thing I wanted to say. I just wanted to tell you that it's worth remembering what process we use to produce transparent and available ratings on our website so that everyone can see them. Such ratings are decided collegially by different analysts. We often hear that one analyst came up with a credit rating for a given country. That's not the case. We talk with peer countries to ensure consistency. In the end, this enables us to analyze the situation of different countries. For a long time, Tanzania had a rating of BWA. And to give you an idea, France has the same rating when it comes to political risks. BAA. What people do not usually see is that we've been talking on these topics for 3 years, and when we choose to lower credit rating, we explain our decisions. Our baseline is a central scenario that stays the same, but on more negative, more extreme events, we reach the BAA level of credit rating, and that's something that we do by working together. But we're really transparent and modest on our approach. We are not geopolitical experts. We have, or rather, we do have experience, and we talk with geopolitical experts to have informed views, and we do not change credit ratings overnight, not at all. This decision is backed by several years of talks with experts. For instance, I like telling you about the example of Russia. To give Russia the credit rating BAA before the default of Russia and before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we researched the topic. We were aware of our responsibilities as far as geopolitical risks were concerned. And we presented an array of scenarios, and negative scenarios had more weight on our decision than we had planned. And we had talked at length with experts before changing the country's credit rating. So that goes to show how our processes work. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lucie. That was very interesting. I just have a question. The global geopolitical risk linked to more aligned countries, countries aligned with values and models of the international financial community. So the Western bloc of countries. How is that taken into account compared to more vulnerable countries? Do you factor in such elements at the same time? We encompass that kind of question in the geopolitical risk, in the political risk, rather. There are social norms that have to be respected, and if such norms are not respected, this may lead to a loss of support. What's hard to explain is how much people in a given society accept norm, how much they accept norms that we could call Western norms. I don't really know how to call them. What's hard to know is to see how much or how little the people of a country accept such norms. And in turn, we can explain that there's an issue with alignment with such norms. The problem is that the country in question will not receive as much support as if it had been more aligned. And the opposite could be true. A country which is not as aligned with such norms may choose to do so. And I'm not talking about countries where there's a complete reshaping of the economy that needs to happen. And it's hard to say because I come from France and I know there are inequalities in our society. For instance, there's an imbalance in countries, a major country in East Asia, for instance. But maybe in that country, having such inequalities would be tolerated and it would be acceptable. So the alignment with a country is really reliant on the support of the international community. China and the US accepted, and France, there's support with the IMF, and we know there's going to be work to be done for the sake of alignment. So I don't know if I'm crystal clear, but basically we factor in that kind of dynamic. Thank you. It was really clear. I have one last question before giving the floor to Jaime de Melo. I have a question on alignment. Because so far we've been talking about the alignment of values, of models, of European and Western values. And new research is stemming from a new geopolitical context. And now the question of diplomatic alignment is an issue. For instance, within the scope of the United Nations. Do you think that's relevant or not in your area? What we focus on, and even though it may not be as salient in our methodology, we focus on how much a country blends in with diplomatic ties with other countries.
On peut débattre, mais qui est une économie émergente, mais qui a beaucoup d'aspects en fait d'une
some
économie
would say
développée.
it's an emerging economy, but when you look at how sophisticated its financial sector is, it really is a developed market, or it's on par with the developed economies. But when talking about emerging market, it is because it's diplomatically isolated, and that has a follow-on effect on its ability to export, on the country's ability to negotiate and defend its position with exporting nations, or even with FDI. Its negotiating power is somewhat limited. So they don't really have an ability to negotiate from a diplomatic point of view, trade agreements, or simply because they are diplomatically isolated, they are more subject to rules. They don't really have a seat at the table. Now, this is definitely something that we take into account
c'est
in
un
our
sujet
own
qui peut être très
analyses.
sensible. Donc, quand on écrit dessus,
So
il faut
whenever
souvent
we
savoir
write
lire entre les
reports,
lignes de notre usage et de
we're
nos
quite
publiés. Mais
sensitive
bien entendu,
to
on en est
various
conscient.
positions, so you always do have to read between the lines, but we are very much aware of these issues.
Passer la parole à Jim de Melo,
Thank you very much for that. We'll now hand over to Jaime de
présenter
Melo. If I could
à
just
la
give you a
fois aux
few
panélistes
quick
et aux
introductory
auditeurs les excuses de
remarks.
Léotier qui a eu un empêchement
Unfortunately, from Leo
à la dernière
Nautier,
minute et qui
had
pourra
a last minute
participer à ce débat. C'est dommage, mais ce débat n'en reste pas moins très intéressant.
last minute
Tout de suite la
change and
parole
unfortunately could not
à
attend, so sends their
Jim de Melo.
apologies. But we'll now hand over to Jaime de Melo.
Ok. Bon, merci de m'avoir invité. J'ai bien sûr posé la question à Bruno, pourquoi tu m'invites
Thank you very much for inviting me.
participer à une discussion
Now,
qui est surtout
sometimes I wanted to ask Bruno, why invite
l'ouverture
me for
qui
such
se
an
déroule
important
dans les
conversation?
couloirs du FMI, de la Banque
Because these are the
mondiale,
conversations which
de
happen in the
Bruxelles
corridors
et
of the
ailleurs.
IMF, World
Et moi,
Bank,
je suis
Brussels, and I'm not there. I'm not privy to those conversations. Here I am,
de l'océan Indien. Et donc,
out in
j'ai
the
pas
middle of
grand-chose à dire
the Indian
sur
Ocean, so I don't really
mes
know what
prédictions
I
ou sur
could
ce que
say
je pense que
aside
pourraient
from
être
my
les effets
predictions as to what the
du
fallout
choc
is going to be.
géopolitique qui se
This is a
déroule aujourd'hui.
geopolitical
D'ailleurs, je crois que
upheaval
Bruno,
that
tu as
we
très
are
bien dit,
currently
on a
experiencing. As
une
Bruno, you said
fragmentation
so
qu'on n'a jamais
well,
vue avant.
this
Donc,
is
prédire le
unprecedented
futur est
fragmentation.
tellement
Predicting the future in
différent et qui
such a
rompt
time,
totalement avec le
it's
passé, c'est très difficile.
very
Alors,
tough
je vais faire, je vais
because
passer 3
what
minutes
awaits is very different to what we have already been
raconter
through.
des vignettes
I
de ma
would just like to
participation, parce
give
que
you a few
pendant une vingtaine
snapshots
d'années,
of my own
j'étais dans les
involvement
couloirs à
because for the
Washington et j'ai travaillé d'ailleurs
20
mes
years ago,
premiers,
well, some 20
ma
years ago, I was there in
ma
Washington,
première
and
embauche était
my
à
first
l'agence
job
bilatérale USAID
was actually
en
working for the
États-Unis
bilateral
d'aujourd'hui, qui était au département d'État. Donc, j'ai travaillé 3 ans là-bas.
discussions with
Une de mes tâches
USAID.
principales, c'était de
My
rédiger
primary
des courriers
job
de réponse
was
aux députés
to
qui
draft
posaient la question
response
pourquoi l'aide
letters
bilatérale.
to
Et donc
parliamentarians
aussi,
saying, why do we
j'avais
have a bilateral aid?
été pour une première mission à
That
Kinshasa en
was my
1975.
first task. Then
Et
I went out
quand on
to
constate
Kinshasa in
quand même
1975.
l'efficacité
And what I
des
observed
activités de lobbying de
was
Mobutu, puisque je me
how
souviens de la première fois
Mobutu's
arrivé, j'étais
lobbying
sur la
was so
couverture de Time
powerful and so
Magazine.
effective because I
Je crois que
remember
c'était
it was
jamais
on the
vu
front of the Time
pour
magazine,
un
which
État
was
africain. Et
something
ensuite,
that
j'étais au
had never
département
happened before
de
for an
recherche de la
African
Banque
head of state.
mondiale, où on a
And
passé
after USAID, I went and
plusieurs,
worked for the World
plusieurs
Bank,
mois et années
where I spent
à
many
faire
months and years
des évaluations des prédictions
drafting
d'ajustement structurel, des
evaluations.
livres. Par la suite,
So
la
these
gestion d'un
were
programme auquel la
documents
FERDI,
which
qui
were
n'existait pas à l'époque, mais c'était le CERDI qui
then
participait, et en
used. It
partie de
wasn't
nouveau.
FERDI, but it was
Et à l'époque,
CRD who was there at the
2
time, and they
millions et demi
used
de
it.
dollars à l'époque qui avaient
There
été
was
financés par la CNUSED, et l'idée était nouvelle. C'était seulement
there was the trade expansion
il y avait
program, which was
missions sur le
funded
terrain,
by
15 pays, et il
by the
fallait
UN,
justement seulement
but
donner
it
des
was
conseils,
only
et il
advisory
n'y avait pas de
documents.
prêt d'attaché, ni tout ce qu'on a
There
de
was it was
de
very much
l'avance
a no strings
qui
attached
était
type approach.
autour des prêts d'ajustement structurel. Quand nous avions été
So this was for
auprès de
structural
l'IMF, c'est le seul
adjustments.
pays qui a lu et qui a discuté avec nous en long et en large, vraiment en
Now, one of
détail
the
des
only
recommandations.
countries to sit down
La Banque
and
mondiale, ils sont
discuss
arrivés, ils
the
ont envoyé un
recommendations
monsieur
with us
David Dollar, mais on n'a jamais
was
eu
from Vietnam, where
$1
World Bank sent out David
Donc ils
Dollar,
avaient réussi,
but
évidemment,
said
sans
that they
aide.
didn't get a single
Donc
dollar
ça c'est
of that aid. So that was quite
un
interesting.
exemple
It
que
was an
l'aide
example
peut être
of
importante,
how
mais
aid
ne l'est
can
pas toujours.
be, you can get a
Ensuite,
lot of aid, but you can also
autre
get no aid.
évaluation sur la Banque mondiale, sur le soutien du commerce en
I
2006.
also was part
Là
of the
aussi,
World Bank
il y a
assessment
quand
for
même
support for trade,
un rapport avec
which
pas des recommandations,
culminated
des
in
constats très
the
mitigés.
2006
Peut-être le
report.
dernier également,
Again,
c'était
recommendations.
DFID qui nous avait demandé en 2009,
In addition to all of that, I
unanimement,
remember
savoir
DFID
quel est le résultat des
ordering
soutiens
a report from us back in
DFID
2009.
à toutes les activités sur le commerce international qui se déroulent à Genève. Il y avait plus de 10
So
millions
this was for
de
trade capacity
dollars
building
qui
in Geneva. There was
étaient consacrés
a lot
à
of
cette aide.
money that was
Ils voulaient
on the
savoir,
table for
c'était un rapport
Trade
confidentiel, mais
Forum
ils voulaient savoir nos
DFID.
pensions. Et
and they just wanted to have our take on it.
Une activité qui était qu'on trouvait était très bonne, c'était le soutien aux pays
In addition to that, there was a lot of support for those countries that weren't WTO members but were looking to become members. So there was support for those nations, not just logistical support, but support to help them with their legal representation and legal fees. I'm sure that you're all quite aware of the fact that there is a lot of fixed costs attached to aid to make sure that aid is effective. There's a lot of documentation that needs to be filled in, extensive reports, conditions that need to be met, which are it's quite cumbersome for a small fund or even a large fund. So what can we learn from all that is that there are various reasons why aid is out there. It's very hard to assess. But actually, when I look at the current situation, I really get a feeling that the geopolitical climate is going to shake up the aid networks, and that aid is going to be more political. It's interesting, I speak of geo-references, global references, and when you're looking at the micro scale, it is really quite interesting to see how aid really has an impact. Now, I will just skip through some of these slides because you're probably wondering why I'm here, why I'm even talking today, because I'm not an expert on the matter, but you're the expert, and I would just like to give you a different point of view. What is the perception? I would say that there are different types of perception of the matter, predominantly through surveys. This is one from the Atlantic Economic Council. The interesting takeaway here, I mean, this is a sample of 355, so it's a small sample, but nevertheless, 13% feel that the biggest threat to prosperity in the coming 10 years is going to be a drop in trade due to protectionism. Granted, this is less than war between major powers and climate change, but it is still a major concern. Those people surveyed, I mean, they weren't just completely picked at random, so they are quite informed people surveyed. This is another one from the WTO, the IMF. This is the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. There are two main parts of this. First, we need to look at the change over time of that level of uncertainty. Now, this is measured according to the way it is reported on in media.
The Global Trade Analysts.
So the GTA Global Trade Analysts, I believe they're called, either twice a year or once a year, they issue a report which covers all of the different measurements. They go all the way back. Sorry, in 2024, there were 3,200 measures. This is considerable, actually, when you look at the way it has risen over the past few years. This all feeds into this new index. It's an interesting one. This is trade policy activity. We can see that there has been a steep rise since 2019, even a bit before, around Brexit. And this ties back to the first trade war between US and China. But even pre-COVID, we can see that the TPA index has been on the rise. Now, it's very hard to know where we will end up, but all indicators show that there is a very steep rise in the overall index of trade policy activity. A few other indicators worth drawing our attention to is this one here. This is the drop in support for aid. This is the change in support for 4 key countries. As you can see, that generally speaking, there has been a drop in support, except for the United States, following the closing of US aid back in April, May of this year. There was been a slight uptick. Now, it's a bit surprising. We just need to trying to understand how they chose their sample for this specific survey. But the United States is an interesting example because it shows that when there is political instability or uncertainty, more so, support for aid also dissipates. I think it would be interesting to have a survey just in the United States, but if we just take this survey here, foreign aid support is likely to continue to decline in coming months and years. And this due to a complete erosion of trust, which we have witnessed of late. This is another one from the World Economic Forum. Every year, they have a number of working groups, partners. Over 900 people took part of this. Now, there is a bit of a selection when you look at overall 900 participants. There are a lot from Europe, North America, no one from Russia. East Asia, it's a 4% participation, so it's not a well-balanced survey. Nevertheless, if we look at the outcome of that survey, this is what we have. Here we're looking at the severity of global risks and how that changes over time. If we look in the top right, these are risks that become more serious, and we go from 1 to 7 from the X and Y axes. That's short-term severity on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we're looking at long-term risk severity. And what we can see is that there is a deterioration, generally speaking, of global risks. More seriously, what we have here is misinformation, disinformation on the top right. And we also have military conflicts in the mix. Actually, a question for you. What could we do? And maybe this ties back to Bruno's question. Or where should foreign aid be channeled towards? To those in need? And then I think this could be interesting for conversation. What do I mean by general economic balance? Is it really garbage in, garbage out, as we used to refer to it? But this is something that you need to take into account, because you need to take into account a lot of parameters. And depending on what parameters you choose, you can come up with varying outcomes. And that's why these models should be taken with a grain of salt. When, for example, in 1994, we had Elena, and then 10 years later we said, let's see if the models were true. And obviously a lot had changed in the meantime, but there were roughly 40 models that showed economic balance.
ça n'a pas beaucoup aidé. Donc,
But the initial models really
je
didn't
dis rien sur
help a
où
lot. So I'm not
l'aide
going to
doit
say
être
so much
dirigée,
as to where
quels sont les pays qui
aid
sont plus
should be
vulnérables que
directed.
d'autres,
Is it to
même s'il y
countries
a
that are more
une
vulnerable than others?
vulnérabilité
Now, while vulnerability
externe et interne que l'on peut
can
essayer de
be experienced
déceler,
either externally or
FERDI a fait
internally,
des travaux
and
importants dans ce
we at
domaine,
FERDI, we try and
mais
understand the
j'ai
difference
deux
between the
slides.
two.
Il y en a un que
But maybe to answer the question, I
le slide
could draw your
ici, que
attention
vous
to
avez
these
peut-être
two
tous
slides.
vu dans la presse.
You may have all seen
En
this.
français, c'est sorti vendredi. Donc,
This was published
j'ai préparé moi
just
deux
last
slides
Friday.
dimanche. Alors, j'ai pris l'extrait du
So
National
this is an
Security
excerpt
Strategy
from the
pour
National
l'Afrique et
Security
j'ai souligné
Strategy
en
for
jaune
Africa,
la
and I
question
highlighted the
d'Afrique.
key sections
Peut-être vous pouvez le
in
lire, vous
yellow,
avez dû le lire
so
dans
you can read it.
la presse française. Et j'ai
You've
même
probably
mis
seen this covered in French
un
media
exposé
end of
justifiant
last
les 10
week.
commandements sur un site qui s'appelle War on the
And this
Rocks,
justifies
qui
the
est
Ten
un
Commandments
site
in
que
War
je
on the
ne
Rocks.
consulte pas souvent, mais qui est quand même
So it's
assez
a website that I don't always look at, but I thought it was
assez
interesting to
bien
look at it this
sur
time
les
because they
positions
gave a very
de la
interesting
droite américaine.
take
Et puis bien sûr, il y a
on
toujours
the American political right.
Economist, et j'ai trouvé que
And also we have
Economist,
in The
quand il
Economist,
a jugé la
when The
politique
Economist
tarifaire de
said
Trump,
that
il a dit tariff selection
Trump's
is almost as random
tariff policies
as
is that
taxing you on
tariffs
the
are
number of
almost as
vowels
random
in
as
your name.
taxing
J'ai trouvé
you
ça
on the number of vowels in your name. I thought it was interesting
probablement assez
to see that.
Alors, on arrive donc l'APD, donc pour moi, enfin, beaucoup d'autres, je pense
So this
que
is public
il y
development
en aura très peu.
aid.
Les États-Unis sont
The United States, bit
sont
by
remplacés
bit,
par la Chine.
are being replaced
On
by
pourrait
China.
ajouter un slide qui évalue la Chine.
I could have added
C'est
in a
assez
slide
intéressant
about assessing
parce
China's
que
aid capacity.
au début, la Chine cherchait à avoir
Because
une
originally
influence
China sought to have
dans les votes des Nations Unies. D'ailleurs, c'est
an
dans
influence
le
within
papier
the United Nations.
de Mathieu et Bruno.
This is what we saw in
Donc,
Mathieu
de
and
ce côté-là,
Bruno's papers.
ça vaut la peine de voir peut-être où est dirigée
So I think it's interesting in that
l'aide de
case
la
to
Chine.
see where Chinese
Donc,
foreign aid is being
le peu
directed.
d'aide qui reste, bien sûr, il faudrait
And the
continuer
little
dans
bit
santé
of aid that
humanitaire.
is left over, some of it
Mais
is for health sector or
il y a un
humanitarian work.
côté, je pourrais dire positif, si jamais il y a un renouvellement
Given
de
the drop
l'AGOA.
in support. But
Parce que
if
moi,
AGOA
j'ai
is
travaillé
renewed,
sur Madagascar en
when I was
2001.
working in
L'AGOA était
2001
arrivée, ça avait
in
créé 50
Madagascar,
000
AGOA
emplois
arrived, created some
autour de Tana. Et c'était
50,000
vraiment
jobs around
la pluie qui tombait du ciel. Tout le
Antananarivo,
monde dit, mais c'est
and
formidable, l'AGOA.
everyone said it's
Mais
fantastic.
déjà,
AGOA is
l'AGOA, quand
brilliant.
même, c'est assez différent de tout sauf les armes, parce que dans
And it's
l'AGOA,
so
il suffisait
different to what we'd had in the
que les
past,
députés décident
because
qu'un pays n'était
with
pas
AGOA,
suffisamment démocratique pour
if
l'enlever de la liste. Ça s'est passé pour, bien sûr,
if a country was
Madagascar,
deemed
c'est
by
jamais
politicians to no longer be
pour,
properly democratic, then they would be
pour
removed from the AGOA list. This is what happened, I believe,
Côte d'Ivoire, je crois, d'autres
for
pays.
Côte
Donc, le
d'Ivoire
problème,
and a few
là,
other countries, I
c'est
believe.
qu'il peut y avoir des effets qui sont aléatoires, même si ça vaut
So
la peine de souligner que si les
some
États-Unis augmentent les tarifs
of
avec les
the
pays
impact was
industrialisés,
a bit hit and
et
miss.
ils ne
Now,
le font
while
pas
America
vis-à-vis des
is
pays
increasing trade tariffs for
africains,
some countries, but not
les
necessarily for African
PMA,
nations,
eh bien, c'est certain on serait en train d'augmenter
this in effect
leur marge, ou leur marge
is
préférentielle augmente.
increasing the
Cependant,
preferential margins that
si
are
on
at play.
regarde l'évidence sur les SPG,
Now, if we then take
non,
into
système
account
généralisé de préférence, sur les États-Unis, il y
the
a un lien
generalized
inédit
preferential
qui montre
system
que
for the United
ça a
States, it's
été
quite clear
vraiment complètement décidé et acheté
that it
par les
was all
sénateurs et par le Congrès. Et
decided
c'était déjà
by
le cas
senators
avant,
and
ce sera
Congress.
encore
I mean,
plus
this was the case in the past, so it's going to be even more so the
pour
case now as we
l'Union
go forward.
européenne. Je
For the
pense que
EU,
tout sauf les armes
I think
et les
all
accords de
but weapons
partenariat économique sont
and
plus
economic
sécurisés que
partnership
l'AGOA.
agreements are
Ils
probably more secure than AGOA,
devraient être préservés.
and they
À
definitely
d'autres,
need to be
de
preserved.
nouveaux partenariats, en fait, c'est un mot bien prétentieux.
What
Je
else?
pense que
New partnerships.
l'OMC étant complètement en débat,
I think the World Trade Organization is
des
in
pays
disarray,
faibles contre la politique bilatérale agressive des États-Unis ou d'un autre pays d'ailleurs. Donc, avoir de nouveaux
which leaves
partenariats
countries
va
vulnerable
requérir au moins une
when
certaine
facing
convergence dans les normes.
aggressive
Pourquoi? Parce que s'il y a une convergence dans les
strategies
normes,
from countries like
peut-être
the
qu'ils
USA, among
deviendront
others.
plus opérationnels. Cependant, si on regarde la ZLECA, si on regarde
If
vraiment ce qu'ils ont
we
fait, ce
take
qu'ils
a
ont
look
promis de faire,
at
il
the
y a très peu, malheureusement, qui ont été
AFCFTA,
fait
so
pour
far
protéger
there
l'environnement
haven't been
et pour avoir une
many
politique
significant
environnementale
commitments
cohérente.
to
Donc, il y a
protect the
de gros
environment.
efforts à faire
So efforts have
du
to be
côté des pays
made
africains. Il y a un peu
in
d'autres
African
qui
countries
résumés,
in
qui
this
sont
regard.
des papiers que nous avons écrits là-dessus. Et si vous voulez, vous
And
pourrez
we
en
have
commencer.
written
Mais j'en
extensively on the
je reste un
topic,
peu
and if you want me to, I can
douteux
share
sur
some
la
of
possibilité
our
d'avoir
conclusions,
ce
but I'm still
soutien
skeptical
au
about
niveau
support,
continental. Parce que
about
pour
support at a
l'Afrique
continental
subsaharienne,
level.
c'est peut-être la taille de l'économie de la France
Sub-Saharan
au total, et un peu
Africa
plus. Donc, il faut
may
quand même
amount to the economic
qu'il soit
strength of France or
qu'il y ait
more.
une politique commune. Voilà.
So it is
Politique
obvious
commune
that
au
they
niveau
need a common
l'Union
policy,
européenne est difficile. Donc voilà mes quelques remarques.
even though
Merci de
it's
m'avoir invité.
complex. Well,
Merci
those were a few
beaucoup,
comments. Thank you
Tim.
for inviting
Avant
me.
de passer aux questions qui nous
Thank you so
sont
much. Before
assez
moving on
nombreuses
to
sur le fait,
questions, and there are many,
notamment à l'intention de Lucie, je voulais vous interroger
especially questions for
sur
Lucie,
le risque,
I
plus
wanted
spécifique
to
lié aux
ask
fonctions
you
géo-économiques
about
entre la
risks
Chine
related
et
to
les États-Unis. Alors,
geo-economic
il y a l'aspect,
positions of the
je
US
dirais,
and China.
commercial, au-dessus de la
There's
ligne de la
a
balance des paiements courants, qui est
trade question
avec
related
à
to
court
the
terme
balance of
probablement
payments.
un avantage comparatif
In the
qui sera donné
short term, there
aux
will
pays
be
exportateurs de
a
matières premières, notamment de
comparative
métaux critiques,
advantage
compte
for
tenu
countries that export
de
raw
l'affrontement
materials.
dans ce domaine de plus en plus prégnant entre la Chine et
There's
les États-Unis.
an
Les
increasing
États-Unis adoptant la
competition
même
between the
logique directionnelle
USA
que
and
la Chine,
China.
notre soutien contre un accès aux matières premières. Mais à long
And
terme,
there's
par contre,
support
les effets peuvent
um,
être très
for
négatifs
us
pour tout le
to
monde
get
parce
access
que
to raw
ils
materials against
peuvent
China. But in the long
conforter
run,
l'Afrique
in the long run,
subsaharienne et les pays les plus vulnérables
they may
dans une
favor
spécialisation sur les matières
sub-Saharan
premières.
African
Et quand
countries.
ils n'ont pas de spécialisation sur les
And
matières
when
premières, les
uh,
couper
such countries are not
définitivement de
specialized
la voie du
in the
développement par
extraction
l'industrialisation,
of
parce que le risque
raw materials, they
qu'on
may
craint
be
est en
left
Europe,
behind
celui
when it comes
de
to
la Chine, des
development,
surcapacités chinoises et plus généralement de la chaîne de valeur asiatique sur le
because
marché européen sera encore plus
China
vrai,
and
notamment
the
si l'Europe
production of the chain,
prit
the value chain
l'ascendant et se
in
protège plus, sera
Europe
encore plus vrai
are
sur le
dominating the
continent
area,
africain et probablement,
and
comme vous le
that is a
signalez,
trend
Tim,
that may be
la plupart
strengthened
des pays n'auront plus,
in Africa.
dans le
Maybe
cadre
most
de la démarche
countries,
de l'ordre multilatéral, les moyens vraiment de se
following
protéger
the disarray of the current world order,
de cela.
may
Et
not
l'autre
be able to
aspect des
protect
fonctions
themselves from that.
géoéconomiques entre la Chine et les États-Unis,
And the
c'est que la Chine est
consequences
devenue un bailleur de
of
fonds très
of
important à
the
l'Afrique.
competition between
Mais si
China
le fait qu'il
and
soit
the
devenu un
US
bailleur très
could
important
be
marque un
dire.
alignement
China has become a
africain,
major
que cet
donor in
alignement
Africa.
est un facteur qui ne permet pas
The
d'accéder
question
aux
of
ressources,
alignment
soit de l'aide bilatérale des autres pays,
may
soit
become an
ce
obstacle for
marché
African countries to get support from
financier
other countries
mondiaux, c'est
or to get
l'illustration de la
support from
fragmentation qui
global
décrit
financial markets.
cet aspect-là de
This
la
goes to
fragmentation,
show
la dimension
how
géopolitique
fragmented the
sino-américaine
world
a des effets
is
négatifs. Voilà,
and
donc je
how the
voulais
fragmentation led by the
vous
US
interroger
has
tous
a
les
negative
trois
impact
sur
on countries.
ces effets qu'on voit déjà en l'œuvre depuis,
We can
depuis
already
maintenant
see
plus d'une
the
dizaine d'années ou
impact
plus d'une
of
quinzaine
such
d'années,
competition and
qui
fragmentation.
se
We've
poursuivent,
been witnessing
voire qui
that for 10
s'accélèrent, se
years.
renforcent. Quelles sont
So
quelles
if
sont
this
les
dynamic
conséquences et comment
stays the same, what do you think consequences will be in the future? And I would like to start by giving the floor to Amadou C, who can share information with us from the IMF. Yes. Maybe I'll start answering the second part of your question. For now, if we keep thinking based on scenarios, we can think of an extreme scenario. There would be a need for countries to make a choice and align with one group of countries or the other. For instance, countries like the Republic of the Congo is an issuer of bonds at present. Because we're in an on-risk market. Investors are massively investing and taking risks. Countries are exporting to China, so they grow reliant on China as well, which is something we can see. And the country I was mentioning was able to issue bonds. So in a baseline scenario for now, I think most countries get support and financing. But nowadays, countries are going through a growing trend of strengthening their domestic strengths. They're strengthening their domestic markets. But there are new risks associated with the trend, because debt is being bought by commercial banks in such countries. Because the financial market is not as sophisticated. So there's a risk between commercial banks and a sovereign risk, and all of that is increasing. So there's a diversification of investments, of pension funds, and so on. And especially with new items of regulation like Basel II, which is a zero risk weight. So far, we're not sure, but it's good to think about extreme scenarios too. Now, as far as trade is concerned, for a while, we thought that if China was developing more, some industries would be localized in Africa, and this would lead to a greater industrialization in Africa. But it's not what we've seen. There are issues of competitiveness. You need labor, of the question of cost, which remains high at a nominal level. I was talking to a man who's an employee in the company Nike, which produces sports clothing. And I was talking about the question of relocalizing production localizing production in Africa, but there are different issues, structural issues that are leaving Africa behind and turning it away from the industrialization it needs. And on these questions, do you have something to say, Lucie? Oh, well, I'm so sorry. I only have 5 minutes left before I leave the seminar. So I saw there were many questions. Can I pick which questions I want to answer? Well, thank you to everyone who's been asking questions. It is always interesting to receive questions during this kind of meeting and exchange. So if I can sum up questions and possible answers I can give, that's what I would do. There's been a question about our methodology for credit rating. We have a committee which gathers different analysts, and they vote on which process to follow. Our methodology is clear. We call that looks for the cycle. We don't want our process to change too much. We want to try and have an overview of predictions and forecasts for 4 or 5 years. So stability is of the essence for us. That is crucial to our credit rating process and for its stability. However, beyond our methodology, the use of our credit rating system by end users matters as well. So there's the whole methodology of credit rating agencies, and then there's what investors do based on such ratings. And sometimes experts disagree with us, and we have them on the phone, and they tell us that they have a different understanding on the situation, and that's a good thing.
D'agences de notation favorise d'avoir plusieurs notateurs et donc plusieurs vues.
But basically, authorities that regulate credit rating agencies favor talks and disagreements. Vendors and sellers have to talk and find an agreement, and it's important to have different credit rating agencies who have different views. You've probably realized by comparing different agencies that for Moody's, Kenya had BAA and it's different to S&P's, and sometimes we completely disagree on the rating that we give to countries. And that's when regulation comes into play, and having informed investors matters too. They have their own due diligence, and that matters. But there are also different questions. We take into account different factors to assess the credit rating and the risk of non-payment, even though sometimes it may seem unfair for the country we're rating. For instance, when Russia decided to invade Ukraine and the price of many goods imported by African countries rose significantly, it's an externality for African countries. They had no part in the conflict, and yet they suffered the consequences. But decision makers and populations suffer the consequences of shocks. For instance, in the case of a downgrade, and it may seem unfair, but in truth, economically and financially, the risk we assess has increased, and it may seem unfair for the countries that suffer the consequences, but the reality at the level of the economy and finances is that there's a higher risk. So we could have a more balanced and fair system to help countries to absorb shocks. But I think you realize what kind of cost that would have for the economy. For instance, when energy prices increased in Europe, the cost was really hard to balance and offset. So it would be hard to fully compensate the situation for a more vulnerable and poor country. So even in the event of an exogenous event, that leads to a higher risk in a country. I've seen questions about Senegal in the chat. And I want to say that in Senegal, the situation is different, and the downgrade of credit rating is due to decisions made in Senegal. So, obviously, when a new government comes into power, it's easier to say, oh, we've just found out about this or that issue. The thing is, the hidden debt of Senegal is what it is, a political context set aside. Obviously, we have to take this debt into account, which leads to a downgrade of the credit rating of Senegal, which is interesting because it hasn't had as much of an impact as what we could have thought. But local decisions have led to a downgrade in the credit rating of Senegal, and we are fully transparent about the reasons why changes of credit ratings may happen. And I'm so sorry to have to leave us. Thank you so much again for inviting me today. And I would like to invite the people who ask questions to keep raising different questions. We are available to answer them in this kind of setting. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lucie. Thank you for being with us today and for your presentation. I would like to circle back on questions on trade now. And for long-term development, it's really important to mention this. Africa hasn't been that integrated to global change, so I don't think there's been much of a change due to the current context. But is it possible to have a strategic output for China? China, which is no longer as welcome as it used to be on European markets, with the value chain in Asia, is this not forcing Africa to give up on a specific model of development based on industrialization? And based on your last slide, I wanted to ask, can we feel more optimistic about the situation, Jaime? Thank you, Bruno. This is a very relevant question. I would like to share a slide briefly to answer your question. Can you see my slide right now?
Non.
No?
Normalement, voilà. Normalement, tu devrais pouvoir partager là maintenant.
You should be able to share your slide as of now. I've already shared it. What do I need to do?
Il faut que je demande, je fais share.
Voilà.
Can I share it
C'est très
now?
bien là. Oui, ça commence.
Yes, great, perfect. Thank you. We can see your screen.
Donc, la question, la ZLECA, c'est la continuation de 50 ans de...
The AFCFTA is a continuation of some 50 years
Excuse-moi, Jim, mais c'est ton écran d'ordinateur qu'on voit là.
Sorry, Jimmy, we can only see your computer screen. We can't actually see your slides.
C'est ça, non?
Voilà, c'est bon, merci.
OK. Donc, voilà. Donc, l'idée, c'est... Made in the world, c'est fini, en gros.
So,
Can we have made
made in the
in
world
Africa, comme on a
is
eu,
no longer the
made
case.
in
Can we now
Asia?
have
Alors,
made
il y
in
a
Africa as we
des
once had
données
made in
qui sont ce
Asia?
qu'elles sont, mais enfin qui sont les
So
meilleures que l'on
take
ait,
the
même si elles ne sont pas très fiables, qui
statistics
vont de
for what they are.
1995 à
They go from
2023.
1995 to 22 or
Utiliser
23.
des indices de
And here we have
participation aux chaînes de
indicators
valeur, notamment
looking at people's involvement,
entre
countries'
les
involvement in value
participations
chains,
régionales et non régionales.
regional and non-regional
Régional,
involvement
c'est
in value
commerce
chains.
de biens
Here
intermédiaires
we're
avec
talking
des
about the
pays
trade
de
of
la région. Les
intermediary
pays de la région ici,
goods
chaque région,
with
Afrique,
countries in the region. So
c'est
here
les pays
Africa
l'Africa,
is
l'Asie,
the
c'est
main region of
tous
the
les pays de
AFCFTA.
l'Asie de
Asia,
l'Est,
that's all East Asian
inclus,
nations, including
la Chine et l'Inde.
China,
Je les ai mis quand même dedans.
and
Après, il y a
India
l'Europe
is
et
in there as
l'Asie
well. Then you
centrale.
have Europe and
Évidemment,
Central Asia.
l'Europe et l'Asie centrale, c'est les 28 et
So that
quelques autres
is
pays
all 28
exécutés
nations
de Comecon. L'Amérique
from
latine et
Comecon.
l'Amérique du Nord. Ce que vous voyez,
Then
c'est
you've
toujours la
got
période
Latin America
entre
and North
95 et
America. It's
2022,
interesting
c'est
because
les
from
dernières 50.
95 through to
Ce que vous voyez,
22,
c'est
that's over
que
20 years,
la part
25 years,
des flux de
the
commerce de biens
share
intermédiaires entre
of
pays africains
intermediary goods
est
being
resté très faible.
traded
5%, ça n'a pas changé.
has only
Et tout le
changed
commerce qu'ils
marginally.
ont eu, c'est du commerce de biens
For Africa,
intermédiaires,
5%.
mais surtout des biens intermédiaires du haut des chaînes de valeur, en haut, c'est-à-dire en amont,
And they're very much in the
les
upstream
matières premières et
section.
autres. Ça,
So
Bruno aussi
primary
l'a dit tout à l'heure.
resources and
Donc
commodities, this is
jusqu'à
what we're talking
présent,
about
entre
earlier. So
95 et 2022, aucun
for the
changement.
past
Et
25, 30
regardez ce qui
years,
s'est
there hasn't
passé dans
been
les autres
great
régions.
change. But look at the other regions.
Évidemment, en Europe, Factory Europe, c'était déjà
So
très élevé.
Europe,
Ça remontait
factory Europe,
encore.
it was very
40%.
high, over
Plus de
40%.
40% du commerce de biens intermédiaires était entre l'Europe et en
So that
95,
is
et ça a augmenté. Et puis en
over
Amérique du Nord, pas tellement.
40% of exports in
Mais
value
ce
chains
qui est
for
important là,
Europe. But what's
vous voyez
important to
ici
take
que
away
l'Afrique,
from
ça n'a pas
this slide
bougé.
is that
Donc
Africa
la
has
question,
remained
c'est
stable or
est-ce
stagnant,
que
if you want.
l'ASLECA pourrait aider
So
à y
will
arriver?
the AFCFTA
Bien sûr, on
help
fait un peu de pub
change
pour
this? And here's a bit of advertising for you.
ce booklet qui
This
est
is a little
disponible sur le
booklet
site
that
de la
I
FERDI.
have
C'est
made available on the FERDI website.
un recensement, un recueil
This is an overall
blogs qui ont été
survey
écrits suite à plusieurs études que nous
of
avons faites avec mes
various
collègues
studies
durant
that I took part
les 10 à 15
in
dernières années.
over the
Et
past 15, 20 years
justement,
with a number
il y
of
a deux
colleagues,
aspects
and
qui sont
I
peut-être
want to
importants.
draw your
Un,
attention to
c'est
two key aspects.
la négligence des biens publics régionaux, très facile à constater,
First,
difficile à y remédier parce qu'il faut la
the
confiance pour les biens publics.
regional
Mais
public
il y a
goods,
beaucoup de choses qui pourraient être
the
faites
section on
sur le
nurturing
côté
of
de l'ASLECA,
RPGs.
des
There's a lot
simplifications.
of work that can come
Et il y a
from
pas mal on a plusieurs
AFCFTA in
études qui
terms
montrent qu'ils ont choisi des règles
of support.
d'origine
So they
qui
started
entraînent
out with a number of
évidemment
original rules
d'un côté la préférence,
that
c'était
on
quelque
one
chose qu'il
side
fallait faire,
you had
et bien sûr de l'autre
preferences
côté
and
les
tariffs.
règles d'origine
On the other side, you have the original rules,
pour empêcher
which were there
que
to
cette préférence tarifaire soit
make sure that tariff
soit
preferences
exercée. Et l'autre, c'est l'accord sur la
be actually used.
classification des échanges, où on montre par des analyses économétriques et simulations
And then
que
in
si,
other
entre
economic
guillemets,
analyses, what we can show you is
les pays
that
africains
if
prenaient au
African
sérieux, mais
nations
pas prenaient au
really
sérieux,
took seriously,
et,
well, I mean,
font
it's
une
for want of a better term,
augmentation,
if
une
they
amélioration
increased or if they
des processus
improved
aux douanes qui sont faisables, ce n'est pas d'arriver au
their
niveau européen, mais à moitié chemin,
their
disons,
trade
ou à
practices,
moins
also their
au
tariff
niveau
practices,
des indices européens, ben,
then
ce
they could be
serait
on par with
équivalent à
European
plus
indexes, then they would
7 à
be
8%
pretty much at 7 to
de réduction
8%
tarifaire. Donc,
of
la
an overall
réponse,
drop in tariffs.
s'il y en a une, c'est que il y a des choses à faire.
So
Et
in short,
jusqu'à
there are
présent,
things that
l'ASLECA,
can be done,
malheureusement,
and
regardez les règles d'origine, ça fait 7 ans
so
qu'ils
far,
négocient.
the
Il y a
AFCFTA has been
1500
looking at those
produits.
original rules, and
500, c'était
there
au
are
mois de
still
mai
around 500 different
2025, il n'y a pas
products.
longtemps.
So in May
500
2025,
500 produits au niveau HS6, ils ne
500
sont pas d'accord.
HS6
Donc,
products for
évidemment, en
which
tant que
no one has
médiateur,
come to an
ils ne sont pas
agreement.
d'accord sur tout, ils sont d'accord sur rien.
I mean, they agree on everything and they agree
Donc
on
voilà,
nothing.
j'ai pas grand-chose d'autre à dire là-dessus, mais
I don't know
il y a
what
du
else I could
progrès.
add to the
Il faut
debate
être
aside from the
positif,
fact
bien
that
sûr,
progress has been
mais
made.
d'un
We
autre
just
côté,
need
il
to
y a des
remain
choses qui
positive.
sont jouables et faisables
There are
qui n'ont pas été
things
faites encore.
that are
Merci.
feasible and that are still yet to be done.
Merci beaucoup, Jim. Il nous reste 4 minutes. Est-ce
We have
que
4 minutes left.
vous avez beaucoup parlé tous les deux d'aide au
We've
développement et
we
c'est
heard a lot
normal
from you
parce que ce sont
about
des flux qui sont les plus
aid
géopolitisés,
for
si je puis
development because
dire,
these
et c'est des
are
flux sur
it's a
lesquels
form of aid
les
or
résultats
financial
récents ont été
transactions which have been
remarqués
highly
et profonds.
politicized.
Donc,
Jim, tu peux arrêter ton partage d'écran, s'il te plaît?
Sorry, Jim, could you please stop sharing your screen? Thank
Merci.
you.
je suis, si je peux vous demander en 2 minutes chacun
If you
maximum
could just now
de
take
conclure
two
sur ce
minutes
sujet,
each to
avant de
quickly
passer la parole
wrap up
à Mathieu Boussichas
before we
qui
hand
a
over to Mathieu
travaillé sur
Boussichas, who
ce sujet
has also been
et
working
sur lequel la
on
FERDI
these
va continuer à
topics
travailler,
and
et
with whom
on fera
FERDI is
sur ce
continuing
genre
to
de thème le
work,
prochain séminaire,
especially in the lead up to our next
consacré au
webinar
dialogue
seminar, which will
géopolitique,
be
géoéconomie
on
et
geopolitical, geoeconomic
développement sera
relations
vraiment
development,
centré sur l'aide au développement. Voilà,
again focusing on
Amadou, si tu peux
development aid.
demander voilà,
So
en deux
Amadou,
minutes sur
just
ce
very
sujet
quickly,
l'aide.
2 minutes.
Oui, non, d'ailleurs,
Any
nous
final
travaillons sur
remarks?
ce sujet en ce moment pour avoir une note analytique
Well, we're currently working
pour
on an analytical report or memo
notre rapport
stemming from our
d'avril
report that was
2026.
published,
On aura
or that will be published
exactement sur ce
in
sujet.
April 2026. It will be
Mais
on
moi,
that
ce qui me
specific topic.
préoccupe, deux
But
choses me
what
préoccupent. La
I
première, c'est
am
que
really concerned of, or thinking
l'espace
of at least,
budgétaire de beaucoup de
is
pays est
the
tellement
budgetary
limité
capacity of a number of
de
countries
se
is so
substituer
limited,
à cette forte baisse de l'aide. Ça
and
va
it's
demander
going
des
to be hard
arbitrages
to replace the
assez,
drop
assez
in aid.
difficiles.
It's going to
Mais
require
l'autre,
a
c'est qu'il y a
lot
aussi cette
of
infrastructure de
compromise.
l'aide. Même
But
si
in
on a le
addition to that,
budget
aid infrastructure, even
pour
though we have budgets
remplacer une aide qui
that will
disparaît,
come in to replace aid as
l'aide
it
venait aussi
disappears,
avec une certaine infrastructure. Par
aid
exemple, si on
also came
prend
with a certain level
un
of
pays, vous
infrastructure to
savez, la
back it
taille des
up.
pays africains,
When you look at
parfois
the
est
size
tellement
of African nations,
grande
sometimes they are
qu'on
so vast that
distribue de
you
l'aide
needed that support where you're distributing
à des
aid
réfugiés d'autres
to, say,
pays
refugees
internally
from
displaced.
other countries or
Il y
internally
avait cette
displaced peoples.
infrastructure que
All of
certaines
that infrastructure is there,
qui
or that
venait avec l'aide
it was
l'aide
needed,
publique au
and
développement.
that came
Donc
hand
même
in
si
hand with
on a
foreign
l'argent, il faudra,
development aid.
par exemple, c'est l'USAID qui faisait
So
super choses
USAID, they were
à
doing
500
fantastic
kilomètres de la
work, some
capitale.
500
Il
kilometers away from the
faudra se
capital city.
substituer à ça.
Well, that is
Et
now
ça
no
prend
longer
du temps,
there.
c'est
We
pas
will have to find
évident
a
et il
substitute
faudra
for it, and
aussi
that
être
in itself is going to take a lot of
efficient dans
time,
cela. Donc
and
moi,
we're
c'est
going to
le
need to
problème,
make
c'est pas
sure
seulement
that it is
l'argent, mais
done
il y a aussi
effectively and efficiently. So it's
l'infrastructure de
not just
l'aide.
money, it's also
Mais
about infrastructure that came with that money.
en avril, mes collègues travaillent dessus et en avril,
So
nous allons
we're currently
avoir
working on a
le tout
report, and hopefully
complet.
in April we will have a much more
Merci, on
in-depth
attend ça
report
avec
on it.
impatience et peut-être justement on vous
Well, thank you
invitera
very much for that. We are really keen
partager,
on seeing what
à
that
partager ces
report will
conclusions.
contain and looking forward to
Jim,
reading it.
sur l'aide.
Jaime, what could you
Ben,
say
écoute,
about
moi,
aid?
je me souviens de mon époque quand j'étais jeune et que je
Well, I
devais
remember
rédiger toutes
back when
ces
I was
lettres
young and I had to
pour les
draft
députés
all of
pour qu'ils
those
ne voient pas donner de
letters to
l'aide. Et
parliamentarians
la
saying
réponse,
why we
souvent,
would or
dans toutes
wouldn't
les
give
lettres, c'est de
aid.
toute façon,
And generally
95% de
speaking,
l'aide revient chez nous.
95%
Ils
of
dépensent
aid
l'argent qu'on leur prête ou qu'on leur donne en
will be
achetant chez nous.
spent,
Bon,
whether
c'était
it's
une aide
given or
liée.
loaned.
Bon,
So
le
it
monde a peut-être changé
was,
depuis, mais
there were certain
je pense
criteria
maintenant qu'on
attached
a
to some of that aid. The
des
world has
données
changed
qui
since
peuvent
then.
être géoréférencées. On
So either it could
pourra
be
certainement faire plus
geo-referenced, as I said a little
et
earlier. We
puis,
could do a little
l'aide
more
pour la
if need be.
santé. Il me semble que l'aide pour la santé,
And aid
c'est
for
là
public
où on devrait
health,
mettre,
I really believe
là où
that
on devrait mettre l'accent
is
parce qu'à la fois,
where the main
on dirait
effort
presque
needs
que
to be
c'est
placed
exogène au
nowadays
développement,
because it
mais
isn't
c'est pas
necessarily
la faute de
changed
l'économie
by
des pays.
external
Et les pays devraient
factors,
vraiment,
and countries they really do
au
need
futur, avoir un certain
to
niveau de santé. Je sais que l'affaire du Covid joue vraiment
have
là-dessus.
basic health
Je pense
systems,
que
and I
c'est
know that a
peut-être
lot
dans
of
ce
countries
domaine
are
qu'il faut
working on it. So
s'approfondir
I think
davantage.
that is where aid should be
Merci, Jim.
focused.
Et donc, je vais laisser la conclusion de ce séminaire
Thank you very much for that,
à
Jim. I
Mathieu
will now hand over
Boussichas,
to Mathieu
qui
Boussichas
est
for his
en
concluding
charge
remarks. He is
de la
in
chaire sur
charge
l'architecture internationale du financement du développement et
of
qui travaille
international architecture
aussi
of development aid and has been working specifically on a lot of these specific topics. Thank you all, and thank you to our three speakers. It's up to me now to wrap up. Very quickly, we started work on the impact of fragmentation on financial flows, and the question of aid was very much one of the core topics. And in 2026, we will hold another round of events. There will also be a number of reports on it. And it all culminates with the question, what does the future hold for Africa? What are the different scenarios? And there's going to be a rising in tension, which means that countries will have to pick a side. Now, that will mean receiving less aid from one side or the other, depending on which side you pick. But also in the first scenario that we could think of, which is a more pessimistic scenario, it will mean an allocation of funding which is not as efficient, because it will be described or determined more along political lines rather than effectiveness lines. Now, that's the negative view. On a more positive view, this fragmentation may actually lead to more competition between competing blocks. And therefore, blocks will have to work together against each other to convince countries to take on their aid. Now, there is a question that I would have liked to ask, but we don't have enough time, and it's a question that we will look at quite closely throughout 2026 and also in the lead up to future events. That brings our webinar to an end. I would like to thank our three speakers, again, with apologies from one of our speakers who unfortunately could not attend it due to a last-minute issue. Thank you very much.